What if I told you that the greatest threat to humanity never needed to shout to be heard? That it doesn't wear a uniform, doesn't carry a flag, doesn't point guns. It just spreads silently, like a virus that invades not the body, but the mind. What if what's destroying our ability to think isn't overt evil, but a much more subtle, smiling, well-intentioned force? Imagine for a second that the true crisis of our time isn't moral, political, or technological, but a silent failure of thought. It's not evil that's killing us. It's voluntary intellectual surrender. Functional stupidity. A kind of strategic, convenient, comfortable unconsciousness. A way to turn off the light within and continue living as if everything were clear. And this force, more than dangerous, is efficient, because it operates in disguise. It presents itself as common sense, as accepted truth, as collective morality. But behind its harmless appearance, it deactivates our lucidity and transforms us into obedient copies of what we were programmed to be. Machiavelli, if he were among us, wouldn't be surprised. He already understood that most human beings don't want freedom. They want security. And security is the price one pays when one gives up thinking. A people who protect themselves from the discomfort of doubt soon become vulnerable to the comfort of lies. And so, we create a society that prides itself on well-intentioned ignorance and despises the lucidity that bothers. Imagine a brilliant scientist, with diplomas plastered all over his walls and international recognition, who suddenly begins spreading dangerous ideas, already refuted by dozens of studies. Or a kind teacher, admired by her students, who begins repeating empty and distorted theories without realizing she's abandoned critical thinking. Or a loving father who makes decisions that jeopardize his own children's health, not because he's cruel, but because he's stopped questioning. These aren't bad people. They're victims of a silent internal breakdown. They are the modern faces of functional stupidity. It's not stupidity. It's not an intellectual failure. It's a voluntary suspension of consciousness, a surrender, an unconscious decision to stop thinking because thinking hurts, requires time, effort, and responsibility. Thinking is dangerous because it forces the subject to acknowledge their ignorance and give up the comfort of certainty. And on this point, Machiavelli would agree with Bonhoeffer. The true collapse of a society begins not with the emergence of evil, but with the paralysis of the critical mind. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment at Yale that exposed this fragility. Ordinary volunteers, ordinary people, were instructed by an authority figure to administer electric shocks to another human being. Even hearing screams of pain, even believing they were actually hurting someone, 65% of them followed through. Not out of sadism, but out of obedience. Because they didn't think, because they trusted the power figure more than their own moral conscience. Machiavelli would write about this coolly. Man tends to do what he's told, as long as moral responsibility can be outsourced, as long as he can blame the system, the authority, the norm. Freedom in this case isn't taken away, it's given away. Bonhoeffer saw this happen in real time. In Nazi Germany, it wasn't just fanatics who supported the regime. It was intellectuals, religious people, artists, teachers, family men. Everyone, to some degree, gave in. Some out of fear, others out of convenience. Most because they didn't want to overthink. And if you think this is a thing of the past, look around you. In times of crisis, fear, and chaos, people tend to cling to the simplest narratives, even if they're false. They prefer emotional security to the complexity of truth. They'd rather be embraced by a mistake than confronted by doubt. And that's why social media thrives. It doesn't inform, it confirms. It creates a world tailored to our beliefs, reinforces our cognitive biases, and rewards us with dopamine every time we choose emotion over reason. Functional stupidity isn't stupid. It's adaptive. It's a form of psychic survival in a chaotic world. But that makes it even more dangerous because it doesn't recognize itself as a mistake. It believes it's doing the right thing. It justifies itself with ready-made phrases, with biased statistics, with emotional theories disguised as logic. And the more it strengthens, the harder it becomes to break this cycle. Because the mind, once dormant, fights not to awaken. Machiavelli understood that the most lasting power is not that which is imposed with force, but that which becomes invisible. True control is that which doesn't even seem like control. It's when the governed believe they are choosing, when in fact they are merely obeying. And the modern world was designed for this kind of domination. A gentle, emotional, morally comfortable domination. The question isn't whether you're being manipulated. It's how many of your certainties were constructed without you thinking for yourself? How many of your opinions came from friction with reality rather than from repeating what's accepted? How many times have you believed something because everyone around you believed it too, or because it seemed easier to believe than to doubt? Bonhoeffer wrote from his cell that, against stupidity, there is no defense. He wasn't talking about ignorance. He was talking about surrender, about a mind that refuses to think again, because that would mean deconstructing everything that sustains it. And this requires a strength few possess, the strength to question what others accept without hesitation, the strength to remain lucid in a world that profits from numbness. This video isn't about others. It's about you, about me, about all of us. Because functional stupidity doesn't choose victims. It infiltrates where there's fragility, fatigue, and overload. It presents itself as respite, and little by little, it distances us from the responsibility of thinking. Every time you share information without verifying it, every time you reject an argument before understanding it, every time you prefer to be right rather than discover the truth, it's there, acting. And now, in the face of all this, a new question arises. If thinking is so painful, if doubting is so dangerous, if the entire system was designed to numb our mental faculties, is there really a way out? Or are we doomed to repeat this cycle century after century, generation after generation? In the next episode, we'll dive into this abyss. We'll face head-on the question many avoid. What happens when thinking men give up? And what remains when the entire culture learns to value obedience above conscience? Don't expect easy answers. Because the truth, as Machiavelli would say, is rarely pleasant. But it will always be necessary for those who refuse to live like puppets. And if you've made it this far, ask yourself, which ideas are you ready to let go of? And how many of them aren't really yours? The journey is just beginning. If you've never been afraid to think differently, perhaps you haven't really thought yet. Because true thinking, the kind that breaks the mold, never comes without a cost. The world doesn't fear new ideas. The world fears dangerously independent ideas. And this is where we begin to understand what happens when thinking people give up. They don't give up because they're weak. They give up because the price of lucidity is often their own integrity. Bonhoeffer, in his dark cell, surrounded by echoes of screams coming from the corridors of the Gestapo, understood something that we still struggle to accept today. Ignorance is not the opposite of intelligence. It is often its surrender. And this surrender is not made by the ignorant. It is made by brilliant men and women who, faced with pressure, symbolic or literal violence, choose to remain silent. They choose to repeat. They choose to obey. Machiavelli, observing the men of power in his divided Florence, noticed a disturbing pattern. The greater a man's intellect, the more refined his ability to justify his own cowardice. It's not that the intelligent don't see danger, it's that they see too much. And so, they build internal defenses that prevent them from acting. They prefer to protect their own stability, rather than face the chaos that the truth always brings. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you felt deep down that something was wrong? An idea repeated too often, a behavior accepted too often, an opinion applauded too often, all of it nagging at you inside. But instead of questioning it, you kept quiet. You smiled, agreed, went with the flow, because it's safer, because it's easier, because no one wants to be the one overthinking in an environment where everyone else has already chosen to stop. Now imagine this multiplied by millions. Teachers who teach without believing, journalists who write without investigating, doctors who prescribe without reflecting, politicians who make decisions without conviction, an entire society functioning under the logic of the automatic, the convenient, the already accepted. This is not fiction. This is now. In 1933, when the Nazi Party came to power in Germany, many of its early supporters weren't fanatics. They were opportunists. They were ordinary citizens who instinctively sensed that something profound had changed. But instead of resisting, they adapted. Some to keep their jobs, others to protect their families, many simply to maintain the comfort of belonging. The machine of evil doesn't need villains, it needs conformists. Bonhoeffer saw this among his own. Theologians, priests, pastors, all citing God to justify surrender to the state, all distorting faith to fit into politics. When he tried to warn, he was silenced. When he resisted, he was imprisoned. When he insisted, he was executed. His mistake, thinking courageously and living according to his thoughts. Machiavelli had already diagnosed this type of system. He knew that oppressive regimes don't need armed soldiers on every corner. It's enough for ideas to be patrolled in the eyes of those who observe, in the ironic smiles of those who judge, in the unspoken words of those who fear. The most efficient control is that which doesn't need to be declared. It's that which silences the subject before they even try. Now think about your daily life. Imagine you're at a family lunch and someone offers an absurd opinion. You know it's wrong, but is it worth contradicting? Is it worth causing discomfort? Most would say no. Better to let it go, better to avoid the strain. But every time you give in, even if it's on something small, you strengthen the habit of silence. And silence, little by little, becomes a system. Look at social media. The opinion that goes viral most isn't the truest. It's the most convenient. The one that reinforces the group. The one that avoids conflict. The one that protects the ego. Smart people shape their own discourse to please, to belong, to keep the algorithm in their favor. And they do this thinking they're being free, when in fact they're already deeply conditioned. Machiavelli would write that freedom is measured by the ability to say what one thinks without fear of being devoured. Today, almost no one speaks their mind. They say what protects, what pleases, what signals virtue, even if deep down they don't believe a single word. We live in an age where even thought has become a performance, where thinking sincerely is risky and acting eloquently is strategy. This mental theatricality has profound consequences. In the medium term, it destroys what Bonhoeffer called inner moral integrity. The person ceases to know what they really think. They no longer distinguish what they believe from what they repeat. They become a reflection of their environment, a mirror of the dominant culture. And that's why he said that there's no argument against stupidity, because you're no longer speaking to a conscience. You're speaking to a reflection. When the mind stops thinking for itself, it doesn't stop functioning. It simply changes owners. And the new owner could be a group, a state, an ideology, or fear. From this point on, any speech, no matter how insane, can seem reasonable. Any decision, no matter how catastrophic, can be justified. It just needs to be charged with the right emotion. It just needs to bear the seal of the majority. Machiavelli, with his cruel clarity, already foresaw this. For him, the people are moved not by reason, but by impression. And the wise ruler is one who understands this logic and masters it. The difference today is that rulers no longer need to dominate the masses. The masses domesticate themselves. They create their own fences, police each other, and denounce any dissenting voice. And they do so believing they are protecting the common good. Nothing is more dangerous than an obedient mob that believes itself morally superior. Because it doesn't doubt. And those who don't doubt don't think. And those who don't think don't realize when they begin to destroy what they once claimed to defend. Have you ever found yourself defending an idea you don't fully understand? Have you ever felt ashamed to change your mind for fear of appearing weak? Have you ever held back from expressing doubt to maintain a semblance of certainty? These are the subtle symptoms of a culture that has traded lucidity for certainty. And the truth is, no one is immune. Not you, not me. Bonhoeffer didn't write his theory to sound clever. He wrote it to try to prevent what was already inevitable. He no longer believed that logical reasoning would save society. He saw that the problem existed beforehand. It lay in the inner willingness to think, to risk, to doubt. When this willingness dies, the debate dies with it. And without debate, only imposition remains. Today we live in an age of fiery speeches and fragile certainties, where there's a lot of shouting and little listening, where people cancel before understanding, where people respond before reflecting. Machiavelli would have a lot to say about this. He would understand that today's leaders no longer need to silence their critics. They just need to let them speak among themselves within their own bubbles, because bubbles are prisons disguised as freedom. So we return to the initial question. What happens when thinking men give up? The answer is before us. They don't just give up, they disappear. Their lucidity fades into normality. Their voice blends into the noise. And the system marches on, without real opposition, only with ghosts of thoughts that once dared to exist. The next part will take us even deeper. We'll explore how entire systems are built precisely to prevent authentic thought from flourishing, not through explicit censorship, but through a psychological and social architecture that turns critical thinking into a burden. And when thinking becomes too painful, what's left? If you're here, you might not have given up thinking yet, but ask yourself, what's stopping you from speaking? What do you feel you can no longer say? We'll meet at the next crossing. There's something more dangerous than not thinking. It's believing you're thinking when in fact you're just reacting. And this illusion, as comfortable as it is sneaky, is the key to the silent collapse that's sweeping entire societies. Today, more than ever, thought has been transformed into a spectacle. And truly, deeply thinking requires silence, internal conflict, and a willingness to challenge one's own reflexes. But the modern world cannot tolerate silence. It demands reaction. It wants real-time opinions, immediate positions, instant judgment. Slow thinking is seen as weakness, doubt as cowardice, silence as omission. And in this environment of emotional urgency, the space for reflection is suffocated. Have you noticed how everything around us is designed to keep us busy, agitated, connected? How many times have you had a real moment of pause in the last few days? Not rest, of mental silence. Authentic thought isn't born in haste. It needs breaks. But breaks don't generate profit, and the world increasingly is driven by what makes a profit. Why do we feel guilty when we stop? Why does calm seem like a threat? Today's free time is colonized by stimuli that keep us distracted. Even boredom has been eliminated, and with it the fertile ground where big questions were born has disappeared. Machiavelli, if he had lived in this time, would have seen a form of control even more sophisticated than direct repression. He would perhaps have written that the new tyrant is not one who silences, it is one who occupies. One who keeps the people entertained, engaged, distracted. A people too busy to think is an easy people to govern. And distraction today is disguised as connection. The bombardment of information creates the illusion of consciousness, when what we have is only fragmentation. We know a little about everything, but we understand almost nothing in depth. We share ideas like trading stickers, without digesting, without reflecting, without filtering. We merely react. How many of your opinions have you formed through deep reading, honest debate, and time spent questioning? How many of them were simply inherited, absorbed, or copied? When was the last time you changed your mind about something important? Not because you were forced to, but because you wanted to understand. This is the tragedy of misdirected intelligence. It's not enough to be able to reason. You need to know where to direct that reasoning. An intellect can be brilliant and still be used to justify profound errors. History is full of geniuses serving toxic ideas. Because the problem isn't just intelligence, it's the moral disposition to use it honestly. And this disposition doesn't arise on its own. It's shaped by environment, culture, and structures that encourage or punish certain types of thinking. And here we come to the most uncomfortable part. Our systems were built to reward superficiality, not by accident, but by design. Have you ever wondered why the logic of the internet rewards the absurd? Why does fake news spread faster than true news? An MIT study showed that misinformation spreads 6 times faster than accurate information, not because people are stupid, but because lies are designed to seduce. They are more emotional, more visual, easier to digest. They don't demand analysis, they demand reaction. And everything in this cycle is interconnected. The algorithm rewards those who generate engagement. Engagement grows with outrage. Outrage feeds on simplifications and lies. And in the end, we have millions of intelligent people trapped in a system that conditions them to think with their stomachs. Machiavelli understood that power doesn't need to control all individuals directly. It's enough to create the conditions for people to police themselves. Today, algorithms do this with mathematical precision. They show you what reinforces your beliefs. They reward you with approval when you repeat what the group expects. And they punish you with silence or rejection when you dare to step out of line. Have you ever been afraid to speak your mind? Have you ever found yourself revising a sentence, not because it was wrong, but because you feared the reaction? Have you ever chosen to remain silent even when you knew you had something important to say? These small decisions, accumulated, define the intellectual climate of an era. And ours, clearly, is sick. Functional stupidity, as Bonhoeffer called it, is not simply the result of individual failure. It is an adaptive response to an environment that makes critical thinking a liability. In a world that rewards emotional obedience and punishes rational autonomy, stopping to think becomes a risk. But the most disturbing thing is that this risk disguises itself as a choice. You think you're deciding, that you're expressing an opinion, that you're choosing, but in practice you're just repeating the patterns that were handed to you. Your indignation was selected for you, your anger guided, your certainty manufactured. And even when you believe you're fighting the system, you may just be part of it from another side. Manufactured opposition is as effective as blind obedience. You just have to stay within the logic of reactivity. You just have to keep dancing, even if the music changes. True silence, deep thought, solitary time for reflection. These are the true dangers to the system. Because in them, the unexpected is born. In them, lucidity flourishes. And lucidity is the only real threat to a system built on mental automatisms. Machiavelli said that a prince should appear virtuous even when he wasn't. Today, we've all been trained to appear to be thinkers, even when we no longer think. The aesthetics of consciousness have replaced the effort of consciousness. And with that, truth has been exchanged for the appearance of truth. Have you ever wondered what's stopping you from stopping everything for an hour, for a day, and rethinking everything you believe? It's not a lack of time. It's fear. Fear of what you'll find if you look inside honestly. Fear of admitting you might have been deceived. Or worse, fear of realizing you've deceived yourself. That's why silence is so uncomfortable. Because in silence, there's no audience. There's no applause. There's only you. And your questions, and your contradictions. It's in this space that real thought begins, but it's also where it can die if you choose the comfort of not looking. The question that remains isn't whether you're capable of thinking, it's whether you still want to, whether you still have the strength to endure the discomfort of doubt, whether you still believe it's worth seeking the truth, even when it hurts, even when it isolates you, even when it destroys everything you thought you knew. Part 4 will take us even deeper into this spiral. We'll expose the role of biology, psychology, and neuroscience in this silent power play. Because the enemy isn't just outside, it dwells within our own bodies. And it's there, in the silence of the brain, that the real battle begins. But before you move on, take a real break. Not to relax, to think. Because maybe, just maybe, that's the last thing the system expects you to do right now. Everything you feel, everything you think, everything you choose, it's not just happening in your mind. It's being processed in an organism that evolved to survive, not to understand. And this difference changes everything, because what we call rationality is, more often than not, just a thin veneer over much older, impulsive and fear-shaped biological structures. We are not thinking machines. We are reaction systems. Imagine the human brain as a battlefield between two forces. On one side, the prefrontal cortex, home to conscious, analytical, and slow thought. On the other, the more primitive regions, the limbic system and the amygdala, specialize in rapid, automatic, and emotional reactions. Evolution favored survival, not contemplation. Therefore, when something threatens us, the body's response is to run, fight, or freeze. It's not to reflect, it's not to understand, it's not to ponder, it's to act. And herein lies the problem. Because today's world, saturated with stimuli, notifications, noise, symbolic threats, triggers our primitive reactions thousands of times a day. And the more activated the reactive part of the brain is, the less room there is for critical thinking. This isn't theory, it's physiology, it's neuroscience. In a study conducted by the University of California, researchers measured participants' brain activity while they consumed emotionally charged content. The greater the emotional charge, the lower the activation of the regions responsible for rational analysis. The brain literally shuts down mechanisms for deep reflection when emotionally overloaded. Now think about social media. Think about newspapers. Think about headlines. They're not meant to inform, they're meant to trigger, to activate your amygdala, to trigger fear, anger, and indignation. Because that's what generates engagement. And engagement is the new currency of the digital age. How many times a day do you consume something that irritates or scares you, even though you know it won't do you any good? How many times do you feel the urge to respond, to fight back, to prove something, even though you know nothing will be resolved? The problem isn't just technology. It's our brain and how it responds to this stimulus architecture designed precisely to be addictive. Addiction isn't just a matter of substance. It's a matter of neural patterns. When a behavior activates the reward circuits, primarily the dopaminergic system, it becomes desirable, even if it's harmful. And today, what activates this system most is social approval, instant notification, the feeling of belonging to a group, of being right, of winning an argument. The problem is that for the brain, it doesn't matter whether the discussion is real, relevant, or productive. What matters is the dopamine spike, the momentary relief from anxiety, the feeling of control. And in this, deep thinking becomes a burden. Because thinking doesn't generate dopamine, thinking generates internal conflict. It generates discomfort. It generates silence. Machiavelli, if he knew the data of modern neuroscience, would write that the most effective ruler is not the one who imposes fear. It's the one who learns to manipulate the people's brain chemistry. And the truth is that today we don't need Machiavellian princes. We have automated systems, algorithms programmed to exploit our biological vulnerabilities. They don't think, but they know exactly how to make us react. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw this clearly. Doctors, engineers, professors, highly educated people began sharing theories completely disconnected from scientific reality. Not because they were ignorant, but because they were exhausted, anxious, overwhelmed. When the human brain enters a state of prolonged threat, it seeks shortcuts. And the shortcuts are emotional. They are simple narratives. They are comforting certainties. A study published in the journal Nature Human Behavior showed that in contexts of stress and uncertainty, the human brain tends to reject information that contradicts prior beliefs, even when that information is based on solid evidence. A stressed mind protects its beliefs like the body protects a wound. Any attempt to question them is perceived as an attack. Have you ever tried to reason with someone who's emotionally upset? Have you noticed how logic doesn't penetrate? How data seems useless? This isn't an intellectual failure. It's a physiological response. And it's this physiology that's being exploited every day by systems that feed on our reactivity. The scariest thing, we don't realize it. Because to the brain, whatever reinforces our beliefs is felt as true, even if it's false, even if it's dangerous. And this explains why highly intelligent people can make absurd decisions. Because intelligence, when coupled with a dysregulated emotional system, only reinforces mistakes. A brilliant brain in a state of fear is a machine for justifying the unjustifiable. Bonhoeffer called this moral surrender. Machiavelli would call it structural manipulation, and contemporary science calls it cognitive bias. But the name hardly matters. What matters is recognizing that we are all vulnerable, and that, if we don't actively acknowledge this process, it will dominate us. Have you ever wondered how many of your certainties were born in a moment of stress? Have you ever reflected on how many decisions you've made to alleviate discomfort, not to seek the truth? Have you ever noticed how often thought is just a justification for an already decided emotion? If we want to resist the era of neurobiological manipulation, We need to relearn how to slow down, to feel our bodies, to notice triggers, to observe our reactions before responding. We need to create internal spaces where thought can arise before response, where doubt can exist without guilt, where silence is not mistaken for weakness. This requires training. It requires discipline. It requires a new kind of courage, the courage to stay with one's own restlessness, to not react immediately, to reject the vice of instant indignation, and above all, to endure the solitude of thinking in a time that values collective reactivity. Can you stop for a minute right now? Can you close your eyes, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, what am I really feeling? Can you observe your impulse to respond to what you're hearing or reading? Can you see that perhaps your first reaction isn't the most lucid, but the most automatic? This pause, in itself, is already a revolutionary act. Because it breaks the cycle, it interrupts the script. It returns control to where it should never have left: consciousness. Machiavelli said that power must always anticipate the movements of the people. Today, power anticipates their clicks, their impulses, their fears, but it can't anticipate what you haven't yet decided. It can't map what you're still thinking. It can't master what arises from a real pause. And that's why authentic thought is still dangerous, because it's unpredictable, it's slow, it's silent. But when it emerges, it changes everything. In the next part, we'll delve into the social root of the problem. Because if the brain is vulnerable, society is the laboratory, and the environment we live in has historically been constructed to push individuals toward conformity, not by force but by culture. And when the entire culture is shaped to prevent thought, what's left for those who still want to think? This question will be our next journey. But before we move on, try to remember a single time you chose to think, even though you knew it would distance you from the majority. Remember that feeling, because it can be your anchor in the times to come. Thinking has never been just an individual act. Thinking is also a collective risk, because every time someone questions, the invisible fabric of consensus begins to tear. Doubt threatens stability, comfortable silence, the social flow that keeps everything functioning. This is why society, in its most subtle and elegant form, was designed not to foster thought, but to domesticate it. Not with explicit censorship, but with invisible rewards and punishments, meted out precisely where it hurts most: the human desire to belong. People don't stop thinking just because they're tired. They stop because they think about the cost. And the cost of disagreeing is almost always social. No one wants to be excluded. No one wants to be rejected by the group. No one wants to carry the burden of being the discordant note in a symphony everyone applauds. And so, little by little, the mind adapts. It still thinks, but only what can be said. It still analyzes, but only what can be accepted. It still doubts, but only silently. The rest it surrenders to the applause of the crowd. Imagine a room with 20 people. 19 say the sky is green. You look out the window and see blue, but no one else seems to see it. Do you risk stating the obvious? Or convince yourself you're wrong? Or worse yet, choose to pretend to agree just to avoid looking awkward? This is the dilemma social psychology has already tested in the laboratory. In the famous conformity experiment conducted by Solomon Asch, 75% of people agreed at least once with a clearly wrong answer, just to align themselves with the group. They knew they were wrong, but they chose to belong. Peer pressure doesn't have to be violent. It just needs to be constant. And the more moral, united, and confident the group appears in its truths, the greater the pressure, because the human mind dreads isolation. It prefers shared lies to solitary truth. It prefers to be wrong with everyone than right alone. And when error becomes the norm, thinking becomes deviant. Have you ever noticed how certain ideas have become untouchable? How certain topics can no longer be addressed without fear of retaliation? Not because they're false, but because they challenge dominant narratives. 21st century censorship doesn't come from the state. It comes from culture. It's distributed, decentralized, applied by each individual who polices others with glances, comments, and subtle exclusions. It's the invisible court of public opinion, and its verdict is always the same: If you think outside the box, you're dangerous. Machiavelli would understand this mechanism perfectly. For him, the most efficient power is not that which represses, it is that which shapes. And a culture can be shaped to appear free, while stifling any thought that threatens its cohesion. Perfect manipulation is that which makes the individual feel as though they are choosing what, in fact, has been chosen for them. And this happens every day, on social media, in universities, in companies, in informal conversations among friends. Bonhoeffer wrote that stupidity is not so much an intellectual failure as a moral bankruptcy. This manifests itself when a person ceases to be the author of their own conscience and begins to live by delegation. They outsource their judgment. They surrender their thoughts to opinion makers, influencers, and leaders. And all this in exchange for the promise of belonging. But the price is high, the gradual loss of their own identity. And when identity is built on repetition and reflexes, it becomes fragile. That's why when someone disagrees, the reaction is violent. Not because the argument is threatening, but because it touches on what's most insecure, the illusion of authenticity. Behind all ideological aggression, there's almost always fear. Fear of being unmasked. Fear of not knowing what one really thinks. In times like these, the courage to think is no longer just a virtue. It's an urgent necessity. But this courage cannot be limited to the individual, because the environment shapes the individual. And if the entire environment is hostile to doubt, even the strongest individual eventually buckles. Therefore, thinking today requires more than personal strength. It requires structure. It requires space. It requires a kind of organized resistance. We need communities where doubt is welcome, where ideas can be tested without excluding those who present them, where error is part of the process, not a sentence, where truth is sought, not merely performed. And this only happens when we exchange the logic of dispute for the logic of rigor, when debate is more important than status, when the argument matters more than the identity of the arguer. How many environments do you know where it's possible to change your mind without being punished? How many people around you accept being contradicted without resentment? In how many spaces is it possible to say, "I don't know," without it being interpreted as weakness? These are the true indicators of a healthy culture for thought. And, if you're honest, you know we're far from that. The most tragic thing is that this erosion of reflection doesn't happen silently. It presents itself enthusiastically, with slogans, hashtags, campaigns, movements, all packaged in an aesthetic of justice, empathy, and virtue, but with no room for complexity, no room for nuance, no room for the most important thing of all, internal conflict, genuine doubt, creative discomfort. Have you ever wondered why we feel the need to assert our opinions all the time? Why has conviction become social currency? Perhaps it's because, deep down, we know our certainties are built on sand. And to maintain this illusion, we need to shout louder than our inner doubts. But the louder the shout, the weaker the conviction. We must reclaim the value of silence, the silence that precedes true thought, the silence that welcomes doubt, that allows for error, that doesn't turn every sentence into a moral battle, because without this silence, only noise remains. And in noise, no one thinks. They only react. Machiavelli is said to have written that the greatest danger to a society is not that the people think wrongly, but that the people stop thinking. Because error can be corrected, but the absence of thought creates vacuums that power fills with symbols, myths, and doctrines. And once the population becomes enamored with these myths, any attempt to question them becomes blasphemy. Bonhoeffer knew this. He wasn't killed for spreading hate. He was killed for thinking too much, for refusing to repeat himself, for insisting on seeing what no one else wanted to see. And what he saw was terrifying. An entire society abandoning conscience to embrace the security of morally validated obedience. And that, to him, was more dangerous than any dictatorship. Today, many wonder how it is possible for good people to defend such harmful ideas. The answer lies here. It lies in this collective logic that turns the questioner into a traitor, that values belonging over lucidity, that rewards the echo and punishes the singular voice. Have you ever held back from saying something for fear of being misunderstood? Have you ever concealed a doubt for fear of appearing weak? Have you ever pretended to agree just to keep the peace? These small concessions are what sustain great irrational consensuses, and every time you give in, functional stupidity advances a little further. Resistance begins with small choices, with the willingness to listen to what bothers us, with the courage to ask what no one else wants to know, with the humility to acknowledge our own mistakes, and above all, with the creation of environments where thinking is not punished, but encouraged. In the next part, we'll explore what it would take, in practice, to rebuild this culture. Not just resist, but transform. Create systems, structures, and routines that favor authentic thinking over mental performance. Because without this collective effort, intelligence will continue to serve conformity, and silence will continue to be imposed, not by force, but by fear. Traversing this path won't be comfortable, but it may be our only real chance to remain human in an age that increasingly values obedience disguised as conscience. We've reached the end, but the true end is never a point. It's a question. And the question that remains now isn't whether the world is sick. That's already been answered. The real question, the one that requires courage, is, what will you do with all this you've just heard? Because knowing is useless if it doesn't lead to action. Understanding is insufficient if it doesn't transform. And thinking, when it doesn't become a choice, becomes nothing more than a distraction disguised as awareness. What's at stake isn't your intelligence, it's your humanity. Bonhoeffer died believing that independent thought is the last bastion of human dignity. Machiavelli knew that power, however subtle, always feeds on what goes unquestioned. And we here are caught between these two worlds, one that pushes us toward mental surrender, and another where resistance requires more than intention. It requires discipline, structure, and strategy. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you still resists. Maybe it's a discomfort, a feeling of disconnection from the world around you. Maybe it's the feeling that, even with all the easy answers, something is still wrong. Maybe it's a forgotten memory of when you thought freely. Whatever it is, this part that's still alive deserves to be nurtured. And it needs more than inspiration. It needs direction. Let's build this now, practically, realistically, and achievably. Not a grand revolution, but a gradual return to lucidity. Starting with you. The first step is to reclaim time. Not chronological time, but the time of consciousness. Each day, set aside 15 minutes of absolute silence. No screens, no conversation, no distractions, just you and your thoughts. Let discomfort arise. Let restlessness come. It is in this space that true thought begins to reappear. The second step is to practice what we call intellectual friction. Each week, choose an idea that you firmly defend. Then look for the best arguments against it. Read, listen, and reflect. Not to abandon your position, but to test its foundation. If it holds up, it strengthens. If it doesn't, it needs to be revised. And that's not weakness, it's intellectual maturity. The third step is to slow down your reaction. Before commenting, before sharing, before responding, stop, breathe. Ask yourself, did I really understand this? Is this information reliable? Am I reacting on impulse or out of conviction? This simple pause, repeated daily, has the power to break cycles of emotional manipulation and give you back control. The fourth step is to rebuild dialogue. This means seeking out someone you disagree with weekly and talking, not to win, but to understand, not to change the other person, but to expand your own limits. True listening is the most powerful training against fanaticism and mental rigidity, and it only happens when ego gets out of the way. The fifth step is to create an environment. You won't be able to maintain lucidity in isolation. The world drags you along even without you realizing it. So choose your companions carefully. Form a small group of people who value critical thinking, honest doubt, and the search for depth. Talk, share readings, and question each other. A mind strengthened by others becomes harder to manipulate. The sixth step is to admit you don't know. Practice the phrase, "I don't know enough about this to have an opinion." This phrase, though simple, is revolutionary because it breaks the cycle of automatic opinion. It opens space for research, for listening, for humility, and, over time, It educates those around you to do the same. The seventh and final step is to protect your integrity with small choices. Don't share what you haven't read. Don't affirm what you don't understand. Don't attack those you don't know. Don't remain silent in the face of obvious distortions just to keep the peace. Because every time you give in, even in small ways, you train your mind to surrender. And every time you resist, you train your conscience to remain. You don't have to change the whole world, but you can change your world. You can regain your mental autonomy. You can create microspaces of lucidity in a sea of noise. You can gradually become someone who thinks deeply in times of superficiality, someone who feels with integrity in times of performance, someone who acts consciously in times of repetition. And it all begins with a silent decision, not to surrender your mind, even when everyone else has, even when it costs you approval, even when it means walking alone, because what's at stake is more than an idea. It's your inner freedom. It's the last space that can still be yours, if you want it. Machiavelli said that men prefer to live under comfortable illusions than to face truths that require courage. Bonhoeffer died for refusing to accept these illusions. And now, the choice is before you, not as a heroic act, but as a daily practice. Silent, consistent. The ultimate question isn't whether you'll resist, it's how. And the answer lies in the small choices, repeated until they become character, until they become culture, until they become a new standard. Not the world's standard, but yours. If this journey touched something within you, if it awakened a part of you that was dormant, I invite you to continue. This channel exists for that, to be a space of lucidity amidst the noise, to be a community of people who still believe that thinking is worthwhile. So, subscribe to the Deep Psyche channel. Like this video if it resonated with you. Share it with someone who's also searching for something more authentic. And if you'd like, comment below with your questions, experiences, or just a thought that came to mind. You can do it anonymously. Sometimes all it takes is a single sentence to ignite a flame in someone else. Because in the end, this is what resistance is. Keeping the flame burning, even when the whole world chooses to extinguish it.